One of the most important things that I try to maintain when I do these videos is impartiality and not letting any preconceived notions affect my opinion about the various games. For some games, like last week's review of Bonanza Brothers, that's easy to do because I literally knew nothing about the game before last week. However, for other games, it's a bit more difficult, especially when it's a game that came out when its source material was white hot and it was advertised on the back of seemingly every comic book and gaming magazine, but the game didn't quite deliver. Or at least that's what I've heard. I guess in today's review, I'll be trying to confirm or deny whether The Simpsons Bart vs. the Space Mutants is in fact a steaming pile, or perhaps maybe gamers were simply disappointed they weren't playing a certain other Simpsons game. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm on a mission to collect and review each and every English language game released for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can play the game on a Genesis with or without some sort of add-on, and then be able to read what's on the screen, I'm trying to pick up a complete copy of it. But not just let it sit on these permanently dusty shelves behind me. Seriously, the carpet in here is terrible. I want to do something more positive to celebrate all of these games, good and bad. By that, I'm going on one by one and reviewing them all, inside and out, with looks at the box and manual, and then also including game footage recorded on original hardware. It might be a little surprising that I haven't reviewed this game so far, or for that matter, any of the games in the Simpsons franchise, but I've got to be honest, I haven't really wanted to. Sure, I enjoy The Simpsons, and I'm not one of these people that say, oh, it hasn't been funny in 25 years, but I'm also not someone who I'd consider to be a fan of the show. Even back in the early days, it wasn't something where I felt like I needed to make sure that I always caught the latest episode. And frankly, if I was watching a sitcom on Fox at the time, it was Married with Children. If I had to guess, out of the, and I can't believe this is even a real number, 750 episodes of the TV show, I've probably seen 30, 40, maybe. Maybe one of these days I'll sit down and invest what would be a very large chunk of my life into watching the show and catching up on probably 1 million references, but I've just got other things I'd rather do right now. Some of you might be saying, oh, well, he's not a fan, I already know how this review is going to go. And to that, I would pay $1 to the estate of Lee Corso and say, not so fast, my friend. You see, there's some Simpsons games that I've played over the years that I think are quite enjoyable. Both the original Data East The Simpsons and the Stern The Simpsons Party pinball machines are very fun games that I've spent more than a few dollars on in the arcades. Also in the arcades, The Simpsons Bowling is probably my favorite arcade bowling game, and it's impossible to talk about The Simpsons in the arcades without talking about the original Konami beat-em-up from 1991. More on that in a bit. 2007's The Simpsons game was an enjoyable platformer that I admittedly had some control issues, but I'd definitely play it again. And probably the best of the bunch is The Simpsons Hit and Run, which I know it's not everyone's favorite game, but I love it. And along with Saints Row 2, it's my favorite non-GTA game. What I'm trying to say is, if there's a game to like here with Bart vs. the Space Mutants, I'm all for it. Is there? Well, I guess we'll see, but first a look at the package. And this is my copy of The Simpsons Bart vs. the Space Mutants. This copy is in decent shape. The hang tab was removed somewhat roughly. I should probably go back and neaten that up. But other than that, the outer cover is in great shape, and the inner cover looks perfect and exactly like it did when it was originally released in June of 1992. Also, as we'll see in a minute when we get to the manual and cartridge, the manual has held up really well also, which is nice. So this copy is definitely good enough for me to call this one a keeper. What you may not be too surprised to hear is that this isn't exactly an expensive game right now. Although, to be honest, I was actually surprised to see what it was going for, with recent sales listed on price charting at around $35 for complete copies. As I mentioned in the intro, the game doesn't exactly have a sterling reputation, especially the NES version, so I've got to be honest, I'm a little surprised that it's selling for as much as it is, and I'm just going to chalk it up to people being curious about it due to it being a Simpsons game, and perhaps wanting to have a copy of it just for that and nothing else. As far as the front cover goes, I think this is some good quality Simpsons artwork, and it comes from that point in time on the Genesis when third-party games were still allowed to use the entire space on the cover if they wanted, and that's just what Flying Edge, aka Acclaim, did here. While the European version used the same artwork, just zoomed out slightly, I'm definitely giving this a win to the American version, as I just don't like how it looks with the black cross-hatching at the bottom. Now, most versions of this game did feature artwork similar to this, but actually if you look closely, what they got was actually this, with this coming directly from the NES version. And honestly, that is the superior cover. It's just got more details and things going on. The Genesis, Master System, and Game Gear releases did come well after all of the other releases of the game, so I guess in that time Acclaim decided that this looked better, but honestly, they should have just ran back that original version. Finally, I've got to mention this real quick. While everyone else got at least a variation on this artwork, Brazil got this version of the art for all releases, and I don't know what's going on here or why this occurred, but this is a travesty and never should have happened. It's not the worst thing I've ever seen, but there's just no reason for it. They got the design right the first time. Flipping over the back, and other than it being on a white background and the screenshots being kind of crummy quality, I actually like this design a lot. Sure, the art on the back is just copy-pasted from the front, but it fills the space well, and I like how none of the screenshots are flat and level. Everything is angled to go along with the chaos represented on the front cover. The captions are a bit lame, but the flavor text is solid and reads how like Bart actually speaks. And I love this bit at the end. So if you care about this sorry planet, you'll do the right thing. Save the Earth, buy this game. That 1-2 punch of using guilt to make you feel like you need to purchase something, that's a marketing chef's kiss there. Opening up the package, and as I mentioned earlier, the manual and cartridge are in pretty nice shape. The manual certainly isn't a mint, but I've seen much worse, and I'm guessing this one hasn't seen much use over the years. Which is actually a little unfortunate, as this is a great manual. It's decently thick and has tons of original art and screenshots from the game. Along with the basic story stuff and controls, there's breakdowns of each of the 5 levels, the items that you can collect in the game, and then finally write-ups on each of the Simpsons, Bart's friends, and the enemies that you'll face in-game. It's basically everything you'd want in a manual. Okay, that's the package. Let's get into the game and try to stop these mutants from taking over Springfield. When it comes to the early 90s, there were few things that were hotter on the television than The Simpsons. The show was so popular that I remember specifically one time in 5th grade, one of the kids in my class got in trouble for wearing a Bart Simpson shirt, which had been banned by the administration due to the fact that they considered the show to be disrespectful. Now, granted, this was at a small private school that was run by a church, so their rules were going to be a bit arbitrary, but this just goes to show just how popular the show had gotten if a kid was going to risk getting in trouble to wear their merchandise to school. But while t-shirts are nice, what was really going to do business with the kids was combine a hot property with the aging but still king of the market in the NES. Acclaim wisely got the rights to produce a home video game based on The Simpsons, and on April 25, 1991, just as the show was closing out its second season, The Simpsons Bart vs. the Space Mutants was released for the NES in North America. The game sold tons of copies simply based on the name alone, and shortly after it appeared on the NES, versions of the game were also released on the usual assortment of European 8 and 16-bit home computers along with DOS, to varying degrees of success. You might be thinking at this point, well wait, what about this Genesis version that I see on my screen, or the Game Gear and Master System versions? Well, one of the things that you can do when you are the king of the market is create arcane rules for third parties to follow that prevent them from releasing games on other consoles that they designate as competing platforms. Of course, those rules would eventually be the source of antitrust lawsuits against Nintendo, but that's a different video, and there's other people out there that have done that way better than I can. What that did mean, though, for the time being, was that if Acclaim was going to be able to take full advantage of their investment into the Simpsons license, they were going to need to get around that rule.
which they did by creating Flying Edge, a separate, and I'm putting huge air quotes in the air right now around separate, division of the company that was dedicated to releasing their games for Sega-based platforms. Flying Edge was founded in May of 1992, and wouldn't you know it, Bart vs. the Space Mutants was released for the Genesis just a month later. It's amazing how that works. It's almost as if Acclaim had already internally developed the game in defiance of Nintendo, and they just had to wait for the lawyers to do their thing before releasing it to the market. But that's just crazy talk. Who would do such a thing? Sorry, I've got to surgically remove my tongue from the inside of my cheek after that last paragraph. Okay, well, being that Acclaim had over a year after the release of the NES version to create the Genesis port of Bart vs. the Space Mutants, clearly the Genesis version was going to take full advantage of the 16-bit power under its hood and release a game that was much more impressive than its original incarnation, and more befitting the console's advanced hardware. What? Why are you laughing? Stop laughing. I mean, just look at these fantastic visuals that are in front of you. It's like the cartoon has come to life. Okay, I can't keep this up. No, instead of doing what most reasonable people would expect a game developer to do when presented with more powerful, arcade-inspired hardware and try to release the best possible version of their game, instead what the Genesis got was a game that I can honestly only call a 16-bit release in the most literal terms. Let's start with the most obvious failing in the game, and that's the game's visual presentation. If you were to take a screenshot of the Genesis port of Bart vs. the Space Mutants and show it to someone who had never played the game, and then ask them what console the game came from, the Genesis or the NES, I'm not convinced that many people would say the Genesis necessarily. Now, granted, if you were actually to put the NES and Genesis versions side by side, then it's easy to tell which is which at that point. But honestly, that's only due to the fact that the original NES version doesn't look very good to begin with, so almost anything would be an improvement. When I first started playing the game, I was struck by two things that tend to be typical of 8-bit releases. The first was how simple the backgrounds in the game look. If you were to compare this to something like, say, Sonic the Hedgehog, which had come out a full year before, Bart vs. the Space Mutants looks positively awful in comparison. Now, perhaps it's not fair to compare Bart vs. the Space Mutants to a 4-star game like Sonic that had Sega's full support behind it, but on the other hand, I already mentioned how huge a license like The Simpsons was at the time. Why wouldn't Acclaim try as hard as possible to make the game look good, knowing just how many people were going to buy it? And sure, there's an argument to be made that the look of The Simpsons TV show is somewhat simplistic to begin with. So in that regard, the game is reflecting the source material. But I'm sorry, that doesn't fly with me. For proof of that, look no further than the Quickie Mart in the first level of the game. It's just a random long building with huge windows and a gold door that doesn't look anything like how it looks in the show. It clearly was just put there in the background so the designers could check off the box that said Quickie Mart. They didn't care about making it look good. The second thing that struck me about the game's graphics, and the thing that I actually have more of a problem with, is the game's practically tiny sprite work. 8-bit games are known for having relatively small sprites, just due to various limitations in the hardware. One of the chief benefits to 16-bit consoles is the ability to use larger sprites, which in turn allowed for the consoles to have arcade ports that look closer to the original machines. As best I can tell, rather than potentially have to redesign any of the levels, the developers simply redrew the existing NES game on the Genesis, just using more colors and slightly more detail to the sprites and backgrounds, but keeping all of the physical structure of the game the same. They basically looked at the 16-bit hardware in the Genesis and were like, nah, we're good, we like things the way they are. The end result is a game that, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if, when I get to reviewing the Master System version, looks eerily the same. Moving on from the graphics, I'm going to switch gears and discuss something that I actually like in the game, and that's its sound. Simpsons fans immediately will notice that the classic Simpsons theme is not included here, which I'm going to assume is due to some sort of bizarre rights dispute. It's a little bit weird playing a Simpsons game and not hearing that familiar intro music, but honestly, the music used isn't bad, and it uses similar instrumentation to what you would expect to hear, making the background music right at home and fitting the game well. It's not anything I would want to listen to on a recording, but it does its job, and at no time during the literal hours that I put into that first level did I want to mute the audio. Also, as a bonus, when Bart loses a life, you'll hear a near-perfect sample of Bart saying "Eat my shorts." And considering how hard to find clean voice samples are on the Genesis, that's a really good thing, especially due to the amount of times that you're going to be dying, leading to hearing that voice sample a lot. Having said that, I should probably talk about the gameplay now. If you've played the NES version of Bart vs. the Space Mutants, or, well, any version of the game, you'll know what to expect here, because other than a few very minor changes, the game is exactly the same. Basically, you play as Bart, which makes sense based on the title, and your job is to run and jump through 5 Springfield-themed levels, and collect or destroy different types of items in each level to prevent the Space Mutants from being able to build a weapon to conquer the Earth. And you can do this by either collecting items in each of the levels, or collecting coins so that you can buy other items from shops, which can then be used in various ways that you'll have to figure out, with some items not being that useful and then some being critical. At least the manual says there's 5 levels anyway. Personally, so far I've only seen 3 of them due to the game's 8-bit hard difficulty, which I'll talk more about in a minute. The game starts out with Bart in downtown Springfield, and your goal is to get rid of anything that is purple in color, because the alien machine really just likes purple, I guess. I'm not going to get too wound up about how nonsensical the story is, considering this is a game about a show with characters that talk about onion belts and wear bee costumes, among a million other ridiculous things, not to mention how silly the Treehouse of Horror episodes can get. But the first level at least seems like it's just an excuse to have a reason for Bart to spray paint things. Assuming you can find and figure out how to deal with all of the purple items in the level, you'll be allowed to fight a water balloon throwing Nelson at the end before moving on to the next. At least, I think it's Nelson, but the sprite is so small it's kinda hard to make out. If you did your best They Live impression and used your X-ray specs to suss out which citizens were human and which were aliens, you'll also get Maggie to help you in your boss fight. This mechanic is actually how all of the Simpsons besides Bart make their appearance in the game, as each will assist you in different ways against the level bosses. Just make sure you do actually defeat enough aliens, or else you'll be fighting all on your own. Say what you will about other elements of the game, but I actually really like this mechanic. It's a lot more interesting than other platformers that just make you try to collect all of a certain thing to get an extra life or something like that. And the boss fights aren't impossible without the assist, just slightly more difficult. Once you get away from downtown, the game also has levels that have you exploring the Springfield Mall, Krusty Land, the Springfield Museum, and finally the nuclear power plant, because how could you possibly have a Simpsons game without the power plant? As far as the developers trying to create a Simpsons game that captures the feel of the show, I think I'd say they did a good job, especially considering the fact that the show was probably only about halfway through its second season when development began for the NES version, so a lot of the things that we might associate with the show didn't exist yet. Sure, certain things seem a little bit off or weird, but for a first effort, this certainly could have been a lot worse. Just for comparison's sake, take the arcade game that was released about the same time that the game debuted on the NES. At the time, the Simpsons arcade was wildly popular, and I think one of the criticisms about Bart vs. the Space Mutants at the time was that it wasn't the arcade game, much like the scenario with the initial Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on the NES. But if you look at the Simpsons arcade as a fan of the show, you can't honestly say that it really has that much to do with the show, falling into the same problem that Bart vs. the Space Mutants had, with there not being that much show material to reference yet. So instead, Konami just decided to make a bunch of levels that might be fun to play in general. In that regard, in 1991-92, if you wanted to play a Simpsons game that was most authentic to the show, Bart vs. the Space Mutants was the way to go. While I complained about the Genesis version having visuals that were 8-bit, The game also has another element that's very 8-bit, and it's one that's actually worse to deal with. That element is the game's difficulty. This is a game that I very much would classify as 8-bit hard. You start the game with 3 lives, and to be fair, if you pay attention during the levels, there are certainly opportunities to gain more. However, at the same time, if Bart takes 2 hits or falls in a pit, you'll be burning one of those lives, and they can go quick. And to make matters worse, while you can gain extra lives, you can't regain health unless you finish a level on that life. Think of playing Super Mario Bros. Without mushrooms, or Sonic without rings. It's not something someone would normally choose to do. And then to add insult to injury, there are no continues. So if you happen to finally, say, reach Krusty Land and die because you don't know what to do, well, I hope you like playing through levels you've already beaten. I could see the argument that adding continues might make the game too easy, and if Bart was a bit stronger, I would agree, but this purely seems like something to artificially extend the lifespan of the game, and I can only imagine how many kids rage quit this back in the day, especially pre-internet, without having any type of walkthrough or other assistance. It probably sold some Game Genies though. Going into playing Bart vs. the Space Mutants this week, I didn't exactly have high expectations, just due to 30 years or so of hearing about how it was a crappy game, and of course the fact that it was an acclaimed licensed title didn't help matters. And honestly, after playing it, I'd say overall it's about the quality that I was expecting, but I was pretty shocked that the game didn't make the 16-bit jumping graphics that it certainly could have. And while the difficulty doesn't make the game completely unplayable, I could see it being incredibly frustrating to players, especially those that don't have access to a walkthrough, because not only is the game demanding when it comes to its platforming aspects, not everything that you have to do is very clear. There's some definite trial and error involved, and that's not necessarily a good mix for a game when opportunities to try things is limited. All in all, I'm giving The Simpsons Bart vs. the Space Mutants for the Genesis 2 stars. It's not a game that's for everyone, that's for sure, but if you enjoy a challenge and are a fan of The Simpsons, you might want to give this a look, because it's certainly the best available version of this game.
Okay, and that was The Simpsons Bart vs. the Space Mutants for the Genesis. Believe it or not, even though I wasn't able to get all the way through it this week, I don't hate the game, and I enjoy its originality. I just think Acclaim could have done more when porting it to the Genesis, to not only make it more fitting of the console, but to make it more accessible to players. And perhaps it's because certain things were tweaked in the Genesis port, but I'd definitely say that it is not the awful game that some people have put out there over the years. It just requires a lot of time and practice, and I'm in 100% agreement on this comment from before, convoluted as hell, especially that first level. Thanks for the support, Noah. Next time on Zilog and Moto, the question is can I break this string of 2-star reviews that I've had for the last 3 weeks? Well, the next game up is a sports game for the Genesis, and it's actually a timely review as the NHL has just started its 2023 season, and the Rangers actually look pretty good so far, so fingers crossed on that. But will it be another 2-star review with it being a sports title? Well, let's just say the only way this game gets 2 stars is if I suffer brain damage after Marty McSorley clubs me over the head. I think he learned his lesson. Maybe. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 216. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.